Right, so in this last part, we're going to look into some geometrical insights related with the simplex method, trying to convey on why is it so that the method actually takes way less iterations than it would be expected. Um, so if you think about how many iterations the simplex method should take, it should be proportional with the number of vertices that we know that grows exponentially with the number of variables and constraints. Remember of that number represented the combinations m and n that show you how many possible vertices you have, and that number grows much faster as than the number of growing number of variables and constraints. But it turns out that in practice, uh, the simplex method takes some number of steps that is somewhat proportional to the number of elements in the basis, which is kind of what this big O notation is showing. Um, is trying to indicate. Um, so what we're gonna do now in the next few minutes is just try to develop a geometrical intuition of why is it the case. So first, let us rewrite our problem in a format in which we create this modified matrix A, call it A prime if you want, which is consists of the original matrix A, but it also consists of the coefficients associated with x in the objective function. So for that, I have this auxiliary variable z there, and I'm tying these two things together. So it's equivalent. And the other thing I'm doing is just I'm assuming that my problem is such that my variables can be normalized. So I know what's at the optimal value, what is the optimal value, maximum optimal value that a variable can take, so I can somehow normalize them like such. And that's actually quite common in a few problems like project selection or um, some network problems as well. So that means that my problem looks like so. And if you look carefully on these constraints, this should remind you of the notion of convex combinations that we saw before. So basically, it basically means that what I'm trying to do is to set my axis such that I'm making convex combinations of my column vectors such that they match B. And in the meantime, I'm trying to find that combination in a way that my value associated with the combination, a convex combination of these coefficients is minimized. So I'm trying to find convex combinations that minimize, that match B and then minimize the value of Z. So I can represent this process in this picture right here. So basically what we're doing is assume that, so my basis has m elements, and what I'm doing is creating a mapping which converts this m element structure into a two-dimensional point. And because it's two-dimensional, I can plot on this plane. So that would be the two-dimensional result of this mapping for column A1, and that for the column A3, column A2, column A4, and so on and so forth. Okay. And so basically what we're trying to do is to make convex combinations of these points in a way that they match B, right? And in a way that when I look at the convex combination, resulting convex combination of these points, projected on the vector of objective function value z, I'm going to obtain a value here, or say here, and I'm trying to do such that that convex combination minimizes this. Okay, so basically what we're going to try now, because we're talking about convex combinations, the main thing that should come to your mind is the notion of convex holes. So what is the minimum number of points that I will need in order to be able to represent this B, right? And this connects with the notion that actually gives name to the method, which is the notion of a simplex. So a simplex, or a k-dimensional simplex, is the structure you form when you look at k plus 1 finally independent points, which, taking one as a reference and looking at the vectors they form, it leads you to a collection of k linearly independent vectors. And then when you think about the convex hole of these k plus 1 elements, that convex hull is what forms a k-dimensional simplex. So think in R2, okay? In R2, to have k, if I have k linearly independent vectors, it means that I have k plus 1 linearly independent or finally independent points. And that means that I have a two-dimensional simplex, which is this, formed by the convex hull of my points. So that would be in R2. So in R2, I need 3 points to form a simplex. In K, to form a two-dimensional simplex. In R3, I need 4 points to form a three-dimensional simplex. And you can think of a simplex. The name comes from because it refers to the simplest structure you can form in terms of number of vertices, right? And that's exactly what relates. That gives the name of the method, the simplex method, because what we're doing in the simplex method is looking into, because we have m plus 1 in that little problem we have m plus 1 constraint, our original m constraints, plus the 1 associated with the c's. Our basic feasible solution is formed by m plus 1 elements like so, element columns like so, which in turn are associated with these m plus a with these AC basic points. So in that picture again, because we have, so we are converting this element from a mapping from an m-dimensional space to a two-dimensional space. It means that a basis is going to be in this space something that is formed by m plus 1 points, or 2 plus 1 points. And 2 plus 1 points in here forms exactly what is called a simplex. So if I, for example, look at these points, A1, A2, and A3, I form a simplex in that state. And this simplex is connected to the basis that I'm forming with these m plus 1 elements. Likewise, if I look at these 3 points, I'm forming a different basis now. And the main difference between these two and these two is that because B is not in the convex hull of these points, it becomes clear that I cannot form B with these 3 elements. So it's a basis, but it's not a feasible basis. But in here, these 3 columns form a feasible basis because this point is inside the convex hull, meaning that I can represent this point with these with a convex combination of these 3 columns. All right. So if we look at this into a more general setting, what we actually having is that, like I was saying, these m plus 1 points is forming m-dimensional simplexes or basic simplexes. And because we want to express B as a convex combination of those, what we're basically doing is searching among simplexes, those that can express B, among the simplexes that can express B, searching for that has the minimum value for the objective function. So if you think of, so all of these now will have these points at that same plane that was in the picture before. But now what I'm actually doing is looking how they form the plane that is formed when I look at that simplex and intersecting B. So B is part of the simplex, okay? So in this picture, for example, if I look at the combination D with the points D, E, and C, that would be such that it's not a feasible simplex because I can't represent B by combining these points. B is not part of the convex hull, right? So in this case, I have this is a feasible simplex, so it's a feasible basis. This column is represented by this point, the column represented by this point, and the column represented by this point. This one is another one, and this one is another one. So basically, any of those simplexes that are intercepting B are basic simplexes or basic feasible solutions. So notice that um, um, the main difference. So these are the forming the intersection points more than the feasible. So basically, the main difference between these three bases is the point in which they intersect this B in relation to the axis associated with the objective function value, right? And what so this is saying that all facets are basic simplexes, but only three of them are feasible. And the most important thing is that if you are, say, on this basis, CDF, this is the value of objective function you get. So this is the value you get for, this is Z of CDF. And this is the Z of GEG. GEG. So this is the improvement you see in the objective function when you go from this simplex or from this basis to the next, from going from H to G. And by the way, this is exactly why the simplex method we're talking about pivoting, because to go from the basis CGF to the basis DEG, sorry, DEF, what you have to do is basically to pivot, and you're going to replace the column associated with this point C with the column associated with this point E. So if you think about this figure here, it's literally pivoting along this axis, DF. So that's why it's called pivoting, the process of changing an element between adjacent bases. And that is exactly what, kind of what causes that fact that you don't really have to visit all the vertices, because what you're actually doing is like sort of sweeping the space. So let's look at the same figure as before, but now my M space is being mapped to a single dimension. So because it's being mapped to this single dimension, it means that I visualize a basis whenever I connect 2 points, because M plus 1 is the dimension 2. Okay? And so this A3, A6 would be my initial basis. And in this case, 3-1 would be a feasible basis, 3-2 would be a feasible basis, 3-7, 3-4 would be a feasible basis, 3-8 wouldn't be feasible because it doesn't cross B. But among all the feasible ones, suppose I select 5. And why is that? Because somehow I know is the one with greatest potential in reduction in my objective function. Perhaps I did full pricing and figure out that 5 was the best swap. So basically, from my basic variables A3, my basic columns A3 and 6, I replaced 6 with 5. And that takes me from this objective function value to this objective function value. And when I get to here, what I have to ask myself is, can I improve? And the question is, can you improve? Is looking at the reduced costs associated with these other elements. And the question, the answer, would be yes, because there are a basis down below by replacing 3 with 8 that makes me go even further down in the objective function value. So that means, so that's my Z axis once again. So basically what I'm doing, instead of, visiting the vertices per se, what I'm doing is this effect of sweeping the search area being the axis. And that explains why it goes so much faster than one would expect, because you're not testing every single combination. By jumping from here to here, you're discarding this combination, that combination, and that combination. Well, that because it's not feasible, and that because good. Of course, it could have been that you actually went just from here to there, and that would be improvement. And then you'll see that you could actually improve from this to that, and then from this to that. So this is more an algorithm decision on how you change your bases in your method. But this is what you can demonstrate that what the reduced costs mean. It basically is telling you that our bases crossing B further on that that are lower in the axis of objective functions. And that is this sweeping sort of behavior that we're seeing in this picture is what explains the fact that you actually don't need to investigate all the vertices. You actually discard quite a few of them really fast. And that's why the number of pivots is of the order of m. I hope this is informative, at least to understand the general mechanics associated with the method in terms of its convergence results, and why is it so that in practice it ends up being much faster. Um, thanks everyone for joining, and see you on Thursday at the exercise session. Bye bye.